Greetings, and thank you for joining us for Perspectives on Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism, the next installment in a webinar series organized by the Office of Diversity Inclusion at the University of Maryland. Throughout this series, we've endeavored to center Muslim, Jewish, Arab, Israeli, and Palestinian lives. We know that many of these topics can prompt a lot of emotions as the world continues to demonstrate the harm and violence experienced by so many communities. We hope that you will come away not just with increased awareness, but also grounding in one another's humanity as you listen to this and other discussions. My name is B.A. Medina. My pronouns are Z, here, and heres. I'm honored to be the Director of Bias Incident Support Services. I'm also grateful that you're here with us today.
And I am Leslie Kraft. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Terrapin Strong Education. As a Jewish American, I feel a personal responsibility to uplift conversations that complicate the understanding of Jewish identities in ways that break down the monolith and illustrate the diversity of practice, experience, and ideology within the Jewish community. As we continue this journey to better understanding the vastness that is faith, race, ethnicity, and culture, I am most excited about the opportunity to be in solidarity with people from across those spectra in a way that honors our shared humanity without demanding agreement or sameness. Today's conversation, along with the rest of our series on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, strives to do just that, bringing experts together across difference to discuss, to diverge, and to at the same time hold each other in positive regard. BA and I have the distinct honor of introducing our esteemed scholars for today's panel. We'll start with Dr. Rabbi David Sandmel. Dr. Sandmel is the Chair Emeritus of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, the consortium of Jewish organizations that is the official Jewish dialogue partner of the Vatican, the World Council of Churches, and the Ecumenical Patriarch of the Orthodox Churches. He currently serves as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews. From 2014 to 2022, he was senior advisor on interreligious affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. From 2001 to 2014, he held the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Rabbi Sandmel has also been involved in Jewish-Muslim dialogue and in the trilateral dialogue between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. At the Catholic Theological Union, he team taught a course on the three traditions and led interfaith study trips to Israel and the Palestinian territories. He served on the steering committee of In Good Faith, a CTU-sponsored trilateral dialogue involving the wider community. He has participated in the World Forum for Peace in Muslim Societies in Abu Dhabi and is a founding member of IJMA, the Inter-Jewish Muslim Alliance. Dr. Relly Dörfler-Rosen is a professor of management and organization at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. She received her PhD in organizational behavior from the London Business School. She studies how the social context impacts employees' decision-making. She examines situations in which people in organizational settings behave in ways that end up counter to their own goal because of innate social needs, such as the need to belong or the need for social status. As such, she applies psychological theories to critical organizational challenges, like how organizations should design their selection practices or structure employees' jobs, to seek solutions that improve employees' lives in the workplace and organization success. Most of her research revolves around two specific areas: behavioral ethics and selection decisions and biases. In the aftermath of October 7th, 2023, Dr. Dörfler-Rosen has been thinking about how her scholarship around business ethics and negotiations informs her position on the recent events in the Middle East and how it can inform us more broadly about the conflicts and possible solutions.
Kenneth S. Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. He's an award-winning author and attorney, and was most recently executive director of the Justice and Karen Rosenberg Foundation. Before that, he was the director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee, where he worked for 25 years. Mr. Stern was the lead drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism. He was also an integral part of the defense team in the historic London Holocaust denial case of David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. His newest book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, The Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, New Jewish Press 2020, has been called a must-read, thoughtful and provocative, a gift, a rare and uncompromising testament to free expression, and a blueprint for how to navigate the conflict over the conflict on campus. Now for our fabulous moderator. Dr. Maxine Grossman is the director and associate professor for the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland. Her research interests include the study of ancient Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, methods and theories in the study of religion, gender studies, and articulation of lived religious experience in contemporary society. Dr. Grossman is a founding co-editor of the Journal of Ancient Judaism and serves as the advisor to the undergraduate minor in religious studies and the undergraduate major in religions of the ancient Middle East. Thank you, Dr. Grossman, for facilitating this amazing discussion today.
It's a pleasure to see you all here today, and I'm grateful to you for taking the time to join us in asking some important questions about anti-Semitism. I think there are a lot of different ways we could approach this topic, but today some of the things we want to talk about are fundamental and definitional. What does it mean to talk about anti-Semitism? What do we mean by that term? And how has that term been used, and how can that term be used in ways that might put forward really useful, thoughtful, constructive discourse, or potentially not? To get things started, I wanted to ask each of you to just talk a little bit about how you've come to the discussion of anti-Semitism, by which I mean, what are the academic perspectives or the personal professional work you've done that have led you to see this as a really important question? And what are the methods or stances that you bring to the conversation? Because I think each of you has a unique perspective on this. Ken, would you like to start? And then we'll ask Relly and then David. Does that sound all right to you?
Sounds perfect to me, and I appreciate the invitation to start this off. And I'm really happy that you're putting this program together with, two other people who I want to learn from too today. So that's very exciting for me. My background is that, I grew up in Brooklyn. I went out to law school in Oregon, and this was in the mid to late 70s. And I started seeing some anti-Semitism there, which I had not seen in Brooklyn growing up. I saw the group that was a precursor to the 90s militias called the Posses Comitatus, distributing blatantly anti-Semitic material around the courthouse where I was working. And then I saw a few years later when I was protesting the 82 Lebanon war because I thought it was ill-advised, and I had been working among progressive causes. I was counsel for the co-founder of the American Indian Movement, representing a homeless community. So my people were the people in the progressive movements in Portland in the post-Vietnam. I started hearing some of the same tropes about Jews and Jewish power and so forth from the left that I saw on the right. So that got me interested in how do we understand that? How do we deal with that? Long story short, I ended up getting a job at the American Jewish Committee, not doing so much legal work, but more policy and program work about anti-Semitism. I spent 25 years there. The first thing that I was asked to do is how do we question, from 1989, how do we deal with anti-Semitism on campus? And this is back in the day when pre-internet, and I, went down to an archive in Baltimore and physically copied clips. It was the only place that was taking newspaper clips of things that were happening on campus, and started working with college presidents and others to make sense of this, and put together a manual that I trained a couple hundred college presidents on how do you deal with bigotry on campus. And some of the lessons then, as is now, as you don't use hate speech codes, they backfire, they're constitutionally suspect, and they'll change the dynamic from what do we actually can do as opposed to what side of a line do we want to put speech on. There were tons of things, surveys, classes, and so forth. So that was one of the lessons, and that the presidents should also use their own voices where it's appropriate. I also was involved with a group called the Northwest Coalition, which was one that fought against the Aryan nations and the white supremacists in eastern Washington and northern Idaho. And when I was at AJC, they invited me to go out and do workshops for them on anti-Semitism. So the people that were doing the anti-Nazi stuff, the people that were opposing anti-gay ballot initiatives, had some grounding and thinking about anti-Semitism. And one year, the guy who established it asked me to go and give a keynote. And I said to him, Bill, what do you want me to do? You're the group. I tell everybody else around the country they should copy what you're doing. And he said, challenge us to do something that we haven't done before and that we need to do. So I thought about it. And the people that came to his conferences were people like me from organizations, ethnic, religious, and so forth, labor, police. But the academics who came were only coming because they were personally interested. It wasn't because they had something to contribute. And then that got me to think, gee, what are the academic things that we rely on to figure out if we're doing something that's positive, negative? How do we know? How do we gauge it? How do we choose our resources based on some theories and scholarship? And the answer was that we were flying by the seat of our pants. It's a reaction to people's anger, fundraising needs, and so forth. So that was the genesis, which I could tell you more of the story about, but how the first Hate Studies Center got set up at Gonzaga University because they felt the need at the right time. And that ultimately translates to, I think there are 9 academic centers now for the study of hate, including the one I run at Bard. And to me, thinking about anti-Semitism, people sometimes say it's unique, and it is in some ways. And I remember times when I was at AJC that there were people that would say, try to make it disappear under a homogenized racism or hatred just to make it so that it's less visible. And that's wrong. And we call them out for it. But the flip side, which is the more important to me, is that you cannot understand how anti-Semitism works without looking at about the human capacity to define who's us, who's them, how it gets to dehumanization, how it gets to demonization, and to see the interrelated aspects of it. You cannot combat anti-Semitism alone.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated hearing, especially about this idea of hate studies, which I think is not language that we've used at University of Maryland. And sometimes when you don't have the category, it can be hard to frame things out. I've also heard of the category of justice studies. And I know it's not the same thing, but I think for us at UMD, it's really helpful to know that there's actually an academic field that's asking what's the big picture. And how does anti-Semitism sit within, but in a way that's more complicated with respect to the idea of hate or the idea of discrimination? I hope we can come back to a conversation, especially about how the uniquely American experience of Jewish people has led to a difficulty in the legibility of anti-Semitism in the US. So in particular, that kind of intersection that's not easy to negotiate. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
Rally, may I invite you to speak next?
Sure, and thank you, Ken, and thank you, Max, again for organizing and for inviting me for this really important cause. So my name is Rally. I'll start a little bit with my maybe personal experience because I think it's relevant here. I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli American. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, Israel. All of my family, apart from my husband and kids, of course, are actually there. Many of my friends are there. My grandparents from my mother's side emigrated back to Israel from North Africa, from Libya and Tunisia. Those from my father's side came after the Holocaust from Romania and Austria. So I'm what is called this blend of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jew. De facto kind of half brown, and many, like more than 50% of Israeli population is actually brown or more like close in ethnicity actually to Palestinians. And I don't like actually to evoke kind of the race identity, but I think it may be relevant when we talk later about some inaccurate terms that are being used and how we should actually talk about them. I grew up kind of, I always say, like in duality in Jerusalem. I used to work as a teenager in McDavid. Today we have McDonald's and Burger King. But then back then we had those small chain, and I worked alongside an Arab Israeli. We were friends, we were laughing, we were wrapping burgers together. And at the same time, another day when I went to school on a bus, because in Israel we use public buses, the bus that I just missed was exploded in a suicide bombing. with many people murdered. I've always been supportive of a two-state solution. I know some may not disagree, but in my view, this was always, unfortunately, tragically, the only solution for two people, but we had a lot of people murdered for nothing without recognizing that. I always advocated for peace. I'm not supportive of the current government in Israel, but I'm also a firm Zionist, recognize the Jewish people have also the right for self-determination in their ancestral land, like any other people, including Palestinians. I also recognize being a proponent of a rational, respectful, fact-based dialogue that, although I do not support the current government, in particular not the right-wing extremists who leave no place for compromise, and some of them are de facto racist, that the collective, as a collective, Israel several times wanted peace and the division of land, and there was not enough on the Palestinian side as a collective to agree for that, and I hope this will change. I'm actually following some peace activists, some of them here in DC. You should check Ahmad Fuad al-Khatib is one of them actually, that are advocating for a two-state solution, for abandoning terror and armed resistance, a kind of de facto Arab Zionist, and which I feel this is actually the only solution and hope. On the professional level, my PhD from London Business School is in organizational behavior. So around the age of 30, I left to London to do my PhD in organizational behavior, and then came here 13 years ago to the University of Maryland. So I'm a professor at the business school. So unlike the other respectful gentlemen here, I don't come with the academic or scholarship expertise in anti-Semitism or Zionism. This is not what I research. But I have since October 7 or maybe October 8th kind of been very much going through, I can say maybe a kind of an existential crisis, being kind of thinking about being able to live here in the country that I love very much as well, and to be in academia in general. So again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss it. I also believe that some of my scholarly work is highly relevant. I've been researching and teaching for the last 13 years negotiations, in particular the notion of getting out of a zero-sum mindset, having to kind of trying to enlarge the pie for both sides, creating win-win solutions, moving away from rights and power to interests and win-win. I've also been teaching business ethics. Ethics is also something that I research as well, and talking about issues such as discrimination, such as moral disengagement, blaming, for example, blaming the victim, as happened on October 7th, such as being an ethical leader who does not only adhere to the law and the legality, but also recognize that they have a role as an ethical leader with responsibility. We can talk about this also kind of later in the context of universities leadership. I actually wrote in the Time of Israel about post-October 7 events, and how there is this reluctance to go out of this zero-sum mindset and to label people as either pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, instead of allowing people to actually be both and to understand that, you know, the conflict, they understand the nuance, and at the same time also understand, and this is, I think, for me has been very important kind of realization, that it's important to understand the nuance and the context, but also at the same time, ethics is kind of the navigation of nuance, but also some things are actually absolutely, in absolute level, just right or wrong, right? And we have to adhere to this ethically without hypocrisy or double standards. So for example, terror is never the way, initiation of violence is never the way. So, you know, this is why I wear this yellow pin for hostages and so forth. And I think it's something that's important to signal in the academia. I taught for the first time an undergraduate level in the business school that is called Challenge Your Thinking, Challenge the Conversation, where we guide students through debating, and this is not about just the Middle East conflict, about any debates, and going through research and facts and challenging assumptions, and discussing controversial issues at the classroom, researching both sides, being randomly assigned to one of the sides in the classroom, and then have a respectful dialogue. We dedicated a class to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well, and some of the students actually were talking about how reading, for example, about Palestinians who suffer, and talk about how the violent protests supporting Hamas actually is hurting them, change their minds about some of the protests that we've seen. And finally, with colleagues at the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at the Smith School of Business, we established in fall 2024 the fact-based open discourse initiative FBDI, we call it an acronym. It's intended to model respectful, fact-based conversations and panels. We did a panel on social media and extremism, as well as one on negotiations in the Middle East, with a very explicit goal of leveraging insights from negotiations to the conflict in the Middle East. And this is, again, we can talk about it later, importantly, elevating voices that call for dialogue and mutual recognition and coexistence, and denouncing voices that are about rejecting the other party, that are anti-Zionist, or the other side, or going to the extreme of no, Palestinians do not have rights either, or supportive, or anything that does not support actually. What I also feel is our responsibility in academia is to encourage people to think about what is also ethical and moral, and how we move forward and how we create good in the world. It's the same as we have at UMD, the Do Good Institute and so forth. I think it's, again, our moral responsibility as educators, especially.
Thank you, Relly. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to have you here, not only for your personal contributions, but especially because you bring an angle by working with the business school to a conversation about anti-Semitism that we don't always get to have. I think, as you say, the idea of a zero-sum situation, what I would call binary thinking, is truly a block to any kind of communication, engagement, thoughtful nuance, or context. And in a context where context itself is treated as a problematic idea, I think it's vitally important that we come at this conversation from as many different disciplines as we can. So while I very much value your personal contributions, I also am really excited to hear you say more about the things that organizational behavior or that business ethics can bring. I think that opening up the conversation is something that needs to happen academically and not only intellectually. It needs to happen across the academic silos and the challenges that we have there. Some of that is very much about having hard conversations. So part of our conversation today will be, struggling with precisely those things. We'll also return later on to a discussion of Zionism in particular, how that term is treated and how the ideas of Zionism relate to Jewishness. So thank you so very much. David, may I invite you to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. It's very good to be here with Ken and with Relly, and of course with you, Max. Where to start? So I essentially went into the family business. My father was, and let me think, before I talk about my father, the perspective that I bring to this discussion is the perspective of biblical scholarship and history on the one hand, and also interreligious relations and dialogue. So those are the two organizing, I guess, categories. When I said I went into the family business, my father was a biblical scholar and was one of the pioneers of post-World War II Jewish-Christian dialogue, and the author of books like We Jews and Jesus, We Jews and You Christians, A Jewish Understanding of the New Testament, and one that has relevance to, they all have relevance, but one especially, Antisemitism in the New Testament, ? And so we can come back to that. But my household growing up was interreligious dialogue, Shabbat dinners, Passover seders, and so forth. If there wasn't a clergy person, a priest, a pastor, a nun at the table, it was unusual. So I bring that home experience with me. And after doing an undergraduate degree, I went to rabbinic school, became a rabbi, served in various congregations, went back and did a doctorate in the history and literature of Judaism and Christianity in the Greco-Roman world. And the reason that I mention that is that one of the most important things I think about evaluating scholarship and the shifts in scholarship over the decades has been the importance of identifying anti-Semitic bias when it comes to biblical scholarship. And that relates very much to the dialogue work that I do, because in that work, one can cite scholarship as a way of at least problematizing things that people are teaching in the name of their own tradition. So that is one piece that's very important to me. And then in my career, I have been involved in what we might call a lot of advocacy work. I worked at the Anti-Defamation League for a number of years as their director of interreligious engagement. I served as the chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, also known as IJKIC, a name definitely not invented by a branding professional. But this is a consortium of Jewish organizations with an international footprint, including the AJC, B'nai B'rith International, World Jewish Congress, Reform Conservative and Orthodox Rabbinic and Congregational organizations. And IJKIC positions itself as the representatives of world Jewry to the Vatican, the World Council of Churches, the World Evangelical Alliance, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of the Orthodox Churches. And so I've been involved in a lot of, for lack of a better word, would call high-level dialogues with those institutions, a good bit of which is related to addressing anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism that remains in these organizations. I currently serve as the president of the board of the International Council of Christians and Jews, which was founded shortly after the Second World War to promote Jewish-Christian dialogue and fight anti-Semitism. In the last number of years, we've established something called the International Abrahamic Forum, which brings together Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And again, the broad idea is to promote understanding and respect, and even perhaps Krister Stendhal's concept of holy envy between people. And again, of course, in these settings, anti-Semitism is a very relevant topic. And let me stop there for now, and I imagine we can dig into some of this as we continue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And David, in some ways, I think you are the most layered of anyone I know in terms of your capacity to talk about anti-Semitism. You neglected to mention that your dissertation was not only about biblical studies or about scholarship of biblical studies, but it was a kind of meta treatment that really did engage with the ways that people think about Jews and themselves and their Christianity, and the way Jews think about all those things, Jews and Christian people. And so you just have multi-layered contributions that I hope you will bring. No pressure, of course. Okay, so David, I think you're bringing a lot of layers to your conversation, both in terms of the study of the Bible and the way people have studied the Bible and the way people have talked about the Bible. The other thing that I think is really important is these kind of collective interpersonal tensions. My own sense is that the New Testament and in some ways the Quran both contain responses to moments of origin. And as such, they retain responses to the tensions around origin, which means that they always have a potential to be read in terms of those tensions instead of in other ways. So addressing that from the perspective of the history of theology and the history of biblical studies strikes me as very, very important. Thank you all for being here. What a pleasure. It's hard to talk about this topic, but it's good to talk about it with people who have so many insights and also intersecting and not terribly overlapping ways of talking about them. I'd like to shift now to kind of the question of stuff. I'd like to talk for just a moment about anti-Semitism as a phenomenon. Ken started this a little bit in terms of talking about a history of anti-Semitism in terms of anti-Semitism from the left, from the right on college campuses, and there may be other categories that we bring to that. I think it's common knowledge, and I say that in quotation marks, that anti-Semitism as such is on the rise today. But I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about what we mean by that. When we say anti-Semitism, are we talking about a general set of ideas that's been mentioned? Are we talking about stuff that floats vaguely on the internet and is just sort of a kind of space we all live in, these sort of clouds of thought? Or are we actually talking about material implications and the material realities of how anti-Semitism affects real people? At risk of asking an obvious question, how bad are things really relative to other historical moments? In addition, I want to ask who the anti-Semites are, especially in Europe, but also in the US. We sometimes have trouble saying who we mean when we talk about people who have a hatred of Jews, a hatred of Judaism, or a kind of participation in conspiracy theories about Jews and the Jewish people. Are we talking about an overlay everywhere, or are we talking about some things that are highly localized? What's happening on the ground, and how should we perceive it in a material sense? I'm happy for anyone to take the floor at this point.
Well, if you want, I can take a stab at that. I mean,
Okay.
there's people tend to look at a data point and run with that as opposed to looking at a larger picture and larger history. So if you look at history, and again, just look at one institution, the college campus. At the time of my parents and grandparents' generations, there were quotas that kept Jews out. Now there are tons of Jewish professors, Jewish college presidents, and so forth. So that's a data point to keep in mind. Um, I remember back in the year 2000, the debate about anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, which was, it's gone. Let's get rid of departments. I mean, Lieberman was the vice presidential nominee. There was very little pushback. Um, and so the major issue was then, and it's still a major issue in the Jewish community, and it's a data point, is intermarriage. Jews on one hand have been loved to death, right? But then at the time of the Second Intifada, it was flipped into, this is 1936, 1937. And so we tend to go to those extremes in terms of how we look at it. And I think it's much more varied. Um, it's attitudes, it's behavior. It's, to me, one of the key things is what leaders are doing. And the mistake I've seen, I think, for a lot of the organized Jewish community is just to want to boil down to think about anti-Semitism is what people are saying about Jews or what people are saying about Israel, and put it on one side of a line or the other. And that's, one of the things I talked about in my Senate testimony recently, that when you look at things through and this is why I have the first chapter of my book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. I want to set people up to think about, as human beings, when we get into these us versus them buckets, as you were talking about, Max, the silos, binary thinking, what happens? We know from brain science and other fields, people crave simplicity, they crave certainty, they get into these moral universes, and they're poised to see people that disagree with them as not only wrong, but evil. That's a human impulse. That's what humans who hate do. That's what those of us who fight hate also do, because we're human too, and our brains work the same way. So when we try to put things in that narrow thing, like we worry about it because it's on this side of the line or that's, we miss so much about what the moment is about now and what I worry about looking at history. What I see the moment now is I'm less concerned about, although I am of course concerned about some of the horrible things on campus and other things that have been happening, but I'm more concerned about the fact that anti-Semitism grows when people are told that there's anybody among us who is a threat that we have to vilify, whether it's immigrants, whether it's Muslims, whether it's transgender folks. Because if you think about how people who get into that mindset think, they tend to want to go to conspiracy theories. That's why the people at Charlottesville, where this was about Confederate statues, were yelling, "Jews will not replace us." We're losing, we're white supremacists. We're better than these people of color. We're losing to them. How could that possibly happen? Because it's Jews behind the scenes making this happen. So those are the things that worry me when we push people into these buckets. And if you look at Jewish history in the United States, some of the times that were most difficult in the last, century plus for Jews, when, the Palmer raids, and we were, rounding up people like we seem to be rounding up people now, or the McCarthy era when we were saying there's speech we don't like, we're going to use law to suppress it. Those are the environments that are worrying to me. I think if you look at Jewish history and the history of other groups that are fighting hatred, a precondition for being able to do it effectively is strong democratic institutions. And I worry at the moment most about the attack on democratic institutions, including free speech. And I think that makes it harder for Jews and more dangerous for Jews.
I'm struck by the way that your response kind of recognizes, again, a longer history of Jewish experience that goes back before the history of the United States. And again, a kind of way of thinking about Jews as not the typical minority in the US where we do think in such binary terms. And we can come back to this later, but I'm really curious to see how we might negotiate that. There's an old expression in Jewish studies about Jews as fitting in or sticking out. And there's something very interesting here that you're identifying about the idea that Jews are most in danger in the US when other people are in danger. And I think that has something to do with the kind of white privilege that Jews experience in America that's a conditional white privilege. Jews are only white until they're not. So I think there's really something very powerful to think about there. Thank you for that. David or Relly, would you like to go next? Maybe you can each speak and then we can talk about this some more.
Sure.
Please,
Sorry.
Relly.
Sure. So first, I would start by agreeing with Ken about, democratic institution, free speech. Totally agree. Hopefully we all agree on that. I think to your question before, Max, I feel that things are bad. I think there are different kind of manifestation of anti-Semitism. I think what scares me now is I think that this kind of ancient hate is actually sometimes is disguised as kind of, and I'll talk about anti-Zionism in a second, as anti-Zionism is underreported, is weaponized sometimes. And this bothers me a lot. So maybe actually it's important to put also kind of definitions. I know I always think about how anti-Semitism, so, Arabs are also Semite. So anti-Semitism is not the best kind of term. It should be maybe Jew hatred because it was also always kind of intended towards Jews, but we cannot kind of change this. But this is something, and again, to me, the elephant in the room has been since, again, I'm talking, and I think things have changed for me in my experience here since October 7th, as to many other, especially Israelis, but also I think Jews here. So the elephant in the room that many university leaderships have refused to tackle, apart from few, is this in anti-Zionism. And I think, again, here we need to be very clear about Zionism, what it is, and it is the right of the Jewish people, just like any other people, to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. It's core to Judaism. It's always been for thousands of years. And so factually, if someone does call for the annihilation of Israel, they are negating a basic right of a collective Jew, which they do not do for any other people. So for me, by definition, it is a manifestation of anti-Semitism. And again, it doesn't matter. I'm not talking now about what do we do about it or how we should punish it. I'm just saying we should first recognize it. And we also have to be clear that anti-Zionism is not criticism of the Israeli government. Many of us Zionist Jews are criticizing them as well. I myself demonstrated here and in the US here and in Israel against the Israel government, right? It's in Israel's democracy. We can, and thousands of people, and hundreds of thousands in the street. So it is something that is allowed with no ramification. so again, in my mind, and again, this refusal to discuss it, and not just discuss it, to actually bring it to the curriculum, to understand that anti-Zionism is the new mutant, and again, to me, it's the more insidious one because it's kind of disguised a little bit, because we all know that these Jews will not replace us. Charlottesville is bad. Everyone kind of, in a way, knows that this is bad. But again, anti-Zionism is an old plague. I think I've heard a lot of work by Dr. Einat Wilf, who we featured in our discussion in the panel we did, and Dr. Dana Horn kind of eloquently described anti-Semitism is not regular racism or bigotry. I think also Ken spoke about it before. It is more than that. It is this conspiracy theory. It is this demonization of Jews as if we are responsible for all the evil in the world, depending on what the current evil is, right? Generalizing across all Jews. This is dehumanizing us, right? Something that is not only in the case of Jews. Again, this is a notion of also double standard. So I know, Max, you heard me before, and it's not, I didn't coin this triple D, dehumanization, but double standard as something that is a kind of a clue that we have something anti-Semitic here. You know, and again, in medieval Christianity, all Jews are responsible for killing Jesus, so it was religious reason, and then for the Soviets, it was Jews representing capitalism, so it's the evil against communism, and for the Nazis, it was about race, and we're not pure race, and we're not white enough, and this was also allegedly backed by science and so forth. And if we talk, we didn't mention it before, and I'm very clear about radical Islam, not Islam as a religion, but radical Islam. There is also anti-Semitism there, and Jews should be inferior and do not have the right as a collective to have a state in the Middle East. And for the far left, that Ken also spoke about before this, you know, we are the perfect evil against justice and human rights. And this is, and again, for me, it's also representing those tropes, like in the middle, and this is where I don't see enough discussions talking about, and can educating people that in the Middle East and in Israel, Israeli Arabs, those who are citizens, have, you know, generally have the most human rights in the Middle East. They have equal rights in Israel. They're overrepresented as physicians. They serve in the IDF, in the Supreme Court. There's no apartheid. And yes, there are settlements that I, by the way, oppose to as well. And there are those settlements, and one can talk about them and can talk for a two-state solution, while also, again, talking about agency to the Palestinians, recognizing that even before 48, any compromise was rejected by the leadership, that Hamas is a radical Islamic organization that is oppressing the Palestinians. And we just heard in the last few days, unfortunately, that they were torturing and murdering, you know, Palestinians that would try to kind of rise against this oppression. So this reluctance to provide education that is based on history and facts, and instead kind of indoctrinate and radicalize students to hate, and the reluctance to focus on education that discusses future-looking solution. Again, this is for me what is also horrific. Israel is a fact, is a country. Now we have to move. What are we doing? Like, what are we doing as a future-looking, interest-based solution? So again, for me, and just to conclude, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It is, to me, is the more scary one because it's kind of disguises itself with justice, you know, and human rights. And it is, for me, it's shameful that it's not recognized earlier in the academia. And, you know, and especially because empirically we also know, and I also heard Dr. Dana Horn talk about it, you know, empirically, when there have been in the past, like in the Bolshevik era, people talking about, we are not anti-Zionists, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionist. And this did not, de facto, it actually ended up with persecuting and ethnically cleansing Jewish people. So, and then I think also Dr. Martin Luther King talked about it, you know, when you talk Zionists, we actually talk about Jews.
Okay.
So again, this is my view here, and I feel this is something that, and again, not in the form to go to what Ken was saying, not in the form of banning speech or not allowing speech, but in the form of education and discussion and giving, you know, thinking very intentionally about how you bring facts and both sides to the discussion so we can actually go somewhere.
Thank you very much, really. Thank you. I'm very struck by the way that you frame this, and I think it's very, very helpful. I think that being able to talk about anti-Zionism as a phenomenon and understand what its contents might be, and understand from your perspective that anti-Zionism is itself a manifestation of a kind of longer heritage of conspiracy theory, of generalizing, of the kind of I think demonization is the piece that is most central for talking about anti-Semitism, because it creates the Jew as a kind of symbol, an empty signifier that you can fill up with whatever negatives you want to put. And this goes back to Ken's observation that when anybody is speaking with prejudice against anybody, the Jews get thrown in. I do think we will want to unpack further on in our conversation the idea of that intersection of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So I'm glad you brought it out, and I'm glad you defended it in the way you did. I think that puts us in a position to have a really good conversation about this difficult point. David, you haven't gotten a chance to speak yet. Would you like to talk about the problem of anti-Semitism and to what extent it's really out there and what it's doing?
Well, sure. You asked about how bad it
Yes.
was. That was,
How
I think, your
bad is
initial question. And you know, I think that's kind of like trying to what's the word I'm thinking of? You know, pick up like goo that's going to slip through your hand. You know, it's really hard to get a handle on, quote, how bad it is. Some of that has to do with the way that various organizations do their research, what they consider anti-Semitism or not, whether they consider anti-Semitic speech. Does that come into their data or does it not? Is an anti-Israel demonstration by definition anti-Semitic, and therefore it becomes another data point? These are some of the problems. I think, and Ken, you can back me up on this. I think that while October 7th and its aftermath certainly catalyzed anti-Semitism in the United States, it was already a growing issue. And not all of it related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, and you mentioned the you mentioned the Charlottesville march, and there's plenty of anti-Semitism coming from the right, from right-wing extremists, from Christian nationalists. There's a whole range of groups there. It's not only from the left. So it's a broad range, and some of that, I suppose, is because there's an aspect of anti-Semitism which sort of one size fits all. It really doesn't matter what your perspective is. If you want to find a culprit, anti-Semitism provides that. I really I hope this doesn't derail our conversation, but I really don't like the word anti-Semitism. I think
that a lot of academics share that perspective.
I mean, without going into the whole history of it and so forth, but I think that it elides a lot of the different expressions and manifestations of anti-Semitism. And one of the things, when you say the word anti-Semitism, I think many people, they immediately go right to Hitler and the Nazis. Right. So if something is anti-Semitic, then it must be genocidal, and I don't think that's helpful. I wish we could find another word to use. I will say I mentioned my father's book, Anti-Semitism and the New Testament, which he published in the early 70s, in which he's got a couple of pages talking about how he doesn't like the word anti-Semitism, but he's kind of stuck with it. And so it's on the title of the book. I would also push back a little bit on the identification of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. I think at least on the edges, there are places where one can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. I think those are some fairly small places. And I think that many people who may have legitimate critiques of Israeli government, Israeli policy, and so forth, express it in terms of anti-Zionism, and then fall back on old anti-Semitic tropes in order to express that. So I'm really just kind of, you know, if it was like a Venn diagram or something, there'd be a little space on the side for anti-Zionism that is not anti-Semitic. I mean, the Neturei Karta, right? Are we going to argue that the Neturei Karta are anti-Semitic? This is a group of Haredi Jews who feel that the establishment of the state of Israel was contrary to Jewish tradition. It's preventing the return of the Messiah and so forth. You know, very problematic. Does it, you know, does it equal anti-Semitism? I think that's a problem. I think, you know, and while we're discussing this, especially when it comes to issues of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism in Israel, I have said on a number of occasions that I think it would be most helpful if we could have a conversation in which we didn't use any of these words: anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, settler, colonial, Nazi, apartheid, indigenous, all of these words that I think stop conversation rather than opening up conversation. And there are other words on that list as well. So let me again stop there.
I'd like to get y'all to talk with each other, but oh, Ken, did you want to step?
I just wanted to give me 2 minutes. I wanted to.
Oh, please.
Some very important points, you know, being made. To David's, you know, last point, one of the things I thought was really cool at Bard is I had a colleague that saw exactly what you're talking about, all these words being flung around. Said, we're college. Why don't we have a class? What do these words mean? Why do people hear them differently? And I did, you know, I did the session on anti-Semitism, as you might expect. In terms of the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I also agree it's a little bit more varied. Clearly, and I'm a Zionist. I've been, you know, I started working in the community also about pushback to the anti-Semitism I saw flowing from the Zionism equals racism resolution from the UN that was inspired by the Soviets and so forth, and how it actually set up a place where Jews were being discriminated against. However, what concerns me at the moment is we're going the other direction, the other binary that's saying all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Because to David's point, I think the Satmar or better case of Neturei Karta are Holocaust deniers, but the same thing. They have a religious view that they don't believe in the Jewish state. There are many young Jews on campus, again, a minority, but people like in JVP or if not now and so forth, whose Judaism leads them to a position of anti-Zionism. They say, I can't justify Jewish sovereignty, even if I recognize the history with what this means for how do we treat the strangers or how do we repair the world. I disagree with them, but I'm not going to call them anti-Semites. And then for Palestinians, who I know, I mean, a lot of them clearly, some are anti-Semites, Hamas certainly is, and many others. But there's some will say, well, our objection is this isn't about Jews. This is about what happened to us. If it was somebody else that did the same thing, that destroyed our ability to control our own lives, we'd have, you know, the same concern. So I think there's a lot of gray area in this as well. A couple things about what do we do about it. One of the things that I thought was really inspiring happened in the University of Maryland. I don't know if you guys know Paul Sham, but he teaches on this. I first found a course that he taught it, he didn't design it, where students had to really reenact the Peel Commission from the 30s. Had to play, I end my book with the discussion of this class, where they had to go against type and represent either one of the commissioners, one of the Jews, or one of the Brits in this exercise that was sort of like reenacting in a time machine the guts of the conflict. So what do the Jews say? What do the Arabs say? And how did the Brits hear it? And I first heard about it because there was a Pakistani Muslim woman who had to be David Ben Gurion. And when she said, when I talked to her, she said, "Oh, you think that was weird? I had an Israeli classmate that had to be the mufti." And she said, as much of a pain as he was in this game, the guy who was the Jabotinsky figure was worse. So, real education. And people who come
Yeah.
into it saying we'd figure out how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now I know why it hasn't stopped. The final thing I want to say is there's a program that some Carnegie Mellon professors came up with using AI called Sway, which I actually ended my testimony with. We did a webinar with them. I've done training with Bard faculty. What it does is it's text-driven discussion. So no eye rolls, no raised voices. It's how do you have discussion about huge differences, abortion, Israel, Palestine. And what it does is it stops the ad hominem attacks. It asks people for examples. And it's fun, and the data shows that it's effective to get people to talk about these issues and not just to write off the other side as evil.
That strikes me as one of the first times I've felt good about AI. Really, I can imagine you might want to turn to respond. Is it all right with you if I raise a different question, and then I promise you'll get your time back, because there's a
I want
piece
to
that
talk about the things that Ken was talking, including this way, but if you want later, that's fine.
Is that all right? I
It's
promise
really
I'll come
related
back
to
to
what
you.
you were saying now, but it's okay. I can talk about it later, whatever.
Okay, cool. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to hear you mention Paul Sham, who is the former director of the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies here. Both he and Eli Saltzman, the current director of the Gildenhorn Institute, do a lot of work with simulations, and they really bring a kind of social scientific approach in a way that's just great for students, and that we can all be learning from them. If it's all right with y'all, I'd like to ask a question I'd like to kind of give you your own little simulation, but very briefly, because I think that sometimes one of the problems with any highly intense conversation where views are sophisticated and complicated is that the boiling down can lead to overt confusion and not just a kind of murkiness. I'm sure that y'all are familiar with the signs in the Jewish community that say, wherever we stand with Israel. My understanding is that Hillel International used this slogan on campuses several decades ago, and many, many synagogues have picked this up. My own sense is that this reflects a kind of optimistic Jewish desire for connection with other Jews, and a really strong sense that some things matter most. As far as I would understand it, wherever we stand with Israel means something like, we all disagree with each other, but there is a baseline understanding of what Zionism means. And when the going gets tough, Jewish people will commit to that baseline understanding. However, I think that people who drive by synagogues and people who engage in anti-Zionist rhetoric might perceive this in a really different way. And I was wondering if you all could speak to the idea of a unified American Jewish support for Israel, and whether, and really this is a question for you especially, and I promise you'll get your other time back as well, but whether the need to stand with Israel on the part of the American Jewish community is frankly misinterpreted by people who don't know how complex intra-Jewish dialogue is. Is there a problem here with misperceptions on insider versus outsider understanding?
That's a good question. So I think probably there is misperception, but again, I want to go back to our self-introspection as American, that we may have contributed to this in the academia by not being clear. So again, and then maybe it will connect to what I wanted to say before. I think this whole, maybe it doesn't help to actually keep saying is anti-Zionism, is anti-Semitism. It's just clear to say anti-Zionism is also a sense of bigotry and racism, because again, it's saying that one country in particular, the only one that is Jewish, does not have a right to exist. And that it's fine to be anti-Israel policies, it's fine to be anti-Israeli government, it's fine to point out to human rights violation in the settlements, and they are, and we should talk about them, and Israel does talk about it and usually punishes it. One of my colleagues always says, and I love it, says we also have our villains, right? Like any other people, we are also people. So and they are actually de facto minority in Israel, right? And this whole like, while I appreciate those that talk about, for example, JVP and talking about how they are saying that they cannot accept what happened to Palestinians. Of course, there is, and we should acknowledge that it was difficult, but we should also acknowledge the time that it was a time from going from empires to nations, many nations, and there was actually a partition plan and a Peel Commission to kind of divide it so it's fair, right, to both peoples, right? So for me, it's very hard to accept that and again, of course, they have a right to exist and say their views, but at the very least, we should say what do you promote, and where do you, why can't you see the problem here because you're singling out just the Jewish state, right? So for me, when I see stand with Israel, is standing with Israel's right to exist, again, as a Jewish state like any other state. It doesn't equate with I'm agreeing with everything that the Israeli government does, right?
Right, but it does raise this question of how Jewish people can communicate that. I think the idea of internal debate and internal disagreement is something that can be very hard to communicate, particularly in these, increasingly binary ways of discussion. Do you think there's a problem with letting the complexities insider dialogue become part of a public conversation, or do you think that's valuable? Is there a way to get at that?
I think it's valuable to actually show that there is, right? And by the way, people see it on the news. You see demonstration in Israel. You see that there is a varied opinion. In Israel, you see that Israel is a democracy that has it. I do also think, though, and again, this has been my issue, and this is why we did the panel that we did recently. We cannot always, throughout history, always put the agency on the Jewish people, right? There is also because again, the thorny issue has always been the conflict there in the Middle East. I mean, again, a part of you go to like other kind of anti-Semitism, but the one that I'm talking about, anti-Zionism, again, there is also agency to the other side that people forget to talk about and to say, yes, this is what has happened on the other side. The other side also has, and we should not treat them as lacking of agency. It's actually demeaning to them. They have agency. The Palestinians have agency as well, and they have responsibility to this conflict as much as also some Israelis, some have responsibility as well. And this is why, again, I feel we need to elevate voices. And, and this is like a small thing that I'm doing on my LinkedIn, elevating also Palestinian voices that talk about, let's do that. Let's abandon terror and let's actually go towards a solution that is respectful for both people. So we have to elevate those. And I also elevate, by the way, those voices that I see on the Israeli side who say, yeah, it is wrong. I would never, for example, bring Ben-Gvir to a panel here in the University of Maryland, right? Because I don't want to elevate voices that are extreme on either side. So showing that there is this variation of voices, and showing that and intentionally elevating those that want to coexist and peace, because again, this is not just it is kind of a life and death situation, right? So we need to be a bit more responsible with the voices that we are actually elevating. So
that's really, really interesting that and I like your language of elevating voices. I want to let you finish your thought because I know I cut you off, but then
no, that's okay. That's okay. I think I made the point.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. Again, David and Ken, I'm interested in this question of what happens when insider conversations go wild and when people from a kind of more casual perspective see something that doesn't look familiar. Is there a tension between internal Jewish debate and standing with Israel? I mean, I think Relly has made some wonderful points here, and I wondered if y'all would like to engage.
Sure. I mean, I would say that the statement, wherever we stand with Israel, is aspirational on the part of the people who are putting that sign up. the in terms of nuance and complexity, those seem to be not in great repute these days. Most people are not all that interested in it, and especially, or maybe not especially, but in the case of either anti-Semitism or anti-Israel / anti-Zionism, I think there's a sense of, don't confuse me with the details, because the details don't fit into my narrative, and my narrative may or may not go back to the deep rootedness of anti-Semitism in Western culture. It's kind of a default position. And all of the ways that Jews are imagined, issues of Jews with power, which certainly plays into, it certainly plays into the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It also plays into some of the stuff that we're seeing, I think, on college campuses here. And perceptions of power, and especially of Jewish power, and a lot of mythology around Jewish power. I have to throw in the couple of terms here just to keep things going. First of all, the concept of philo-Semitism and where that fits in. And also, just to make things interesting, Zygmunt Bauman's concept of allo-Semitism. That is the idea that Jews are the other, and it really doesn't matter if it's negative or positive. It's all based on this idea of otherness, and the values of negative and positive don't necessarily fit.
Not to cut you off, can you say a little more about philo-Semitism? Because it sounds pretty good. Philo-Semitism, unless I'm mistranslating it, means loving Jews. Can you?
Oh, yes, and it's another word. It was coined shortly after the coining of the word anti-Semitism by Treitschke, I believe, as a way of dissing people who are opposing the anti-Semitism that had been proposed by Mars and others. So it really, philo-Semitism, just like anti-Semitism is a polite way to say Judenhass, Jew hatred, philo-Semitism was a polite way to say Jew lover. But again, it has many different manifestations, right? Christian Zionism, which again is not monolithic, but that would be one example of it. One could, if one wanted to, describe the Catholic Church since 1965 as philo-Semitic. Someone who wants to have little guys with yarmulkes keeping his books because Jews make good accountants. I won't mention any names there, but I think you know who I'm talking about. That's a weird kind of thing. It's a prejudice, it's a bias, but in some ways it suggests a positive, but also gets into this whole power dynamic. So, it's
classic folk expression. It sounds like you're saying philo-Semitism is not necessarily good for the Jews.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, if you want to take a look at certain manifestations of Christian Zionism, especially those connected with the premillennial dispensationalists, for whom the return of Jews to the land of Israel is a prerequisite for the second coming of Jesus, at which point in some of these eschatological dramas, a certain number of Jews will convert to Christianity and the rest will be annihilated. I'm not sure that that's a positive Jewish view, but if you are an Israeli politician and these people have votes in the United States, you're going to court them. And you're going to court them, frankly, whether or not it's good for the Jews in America. So, I hope I've muddied the waters sufficiently here.
You've certainly demonstrated that Jewish scholarship makes things more complicated rather than less so. Ken, would you like to help us out here?
Sure, just a couple of thoughts. In terms of the lawn sign, um, there's also from hate studies, one of the things that
Mhm.
animates people, not only certainty and simplicity, it's also symbols.
Mhm.
This is a symbol. And I'm sure it's intended as a certain way. And you're right that other people may see that symbol differently. When I was in college, I saw a bit of graffiti that said, if I didn't believe it with my own mind, I never would have seen it. So, whichever bucket you're in, you're going to see it a different way. But I think there's another undercurrent we haven't talked about sufficiently that also, gets into what that sign means and how it's perceived. And it's a reflection of a debate inside the community, which is to be inside the tent. Do you have to have a certain view of Israel? I mean, I documented in my book, going back to the campus, there were times where people, Chabad, atheists, secular, reform, get together and have a meal around a campus Hillel table, not if you have a differences in Israel. Um, and when I speak with JCRCs, and I talk to them about this,
It's a Jewish
community
community.
relations councils in different cities associated, with the intergroup stuff and all that. And so, you have a dilemma to think through, and I'm not going to suggest how you should decide it because I don't have a clue, but you have an obligation to think of the ethical and moral issues here. And they are these. You have a group, like I was talking before about, if not now, and those Jews who came, a lot of them came from Jewish day schools. I mean, David, I think, knows as well as I that a lot of these kids are the kids of grandkids of people that were lay people or professionals in mainstream Jewish organizations. They see the world through a Jewish education. They have a Jewish education, but they come to a different view on design. I will disagree with them for the similar reasons that Relly does, but they have that view and it's honestly held. Are we as a community going to say, okay, if you don't have a certain view, a Zionist view about Israel, we're going to put you outside the tent. Um, and therefore, if you want to do social justice, you want to do interreligious work, you want to do climate change, you can't do it in a Jewish space. That's the mainstream. Or are we going to say, we invite you into the community and we're going to have a reasonable disagreement about Zionism? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a moral implication to discuss that, and that reflects some of what you were talking about with that sign.
Yeah, yes. And I do think that we haven't exhausted the tensions here. Because I think one of the values within Jewish discourse, and I say this as someone whose area of expertise is ancient Jewish sectarianism, at a time when, my Dead Sea Scrolls guys were busy saying that all other Jews were simply going to be destroyed at the end times, which are coming right now. And then, of course, the rabbinic movement that followed that chaos of the first century kind of looked around and said, getting along might be a better idea. But within Jewish history and the history of Jewish theology, the idea of conflict is one that's valued. And there's even an idea of conflict in the name of heaven. And in contrast, there are other major thought systems, whether philosophical or theological, that hold that sharing the same views is the baseline for discourse and participation. And I guess what I'm wondering about, and what I think is really important to talking about anti-Semitism and what it is right now, is whether it's possible for the organized Jewish community to commit to internal tensions and disagreement in the face of real and perceived rising anti-Semitism. You can tell my own bias as someone who studies the history of religions, but I guess I want to ask again, I want to push even harder before we move on to the next thing. There's another expression, again, a folk expression, a shanda, a public shame. Should let me think how to say this. Should the Jewish people, should academics who study Jewish studies, should American Jewish leaders be willing to be robustly in disagreement while fighting anti-Semitism? Or is that too hard? My sense is that, particularly around Israel, there's a significant fear to show disagreements in public, or a significant disparagement of disagreements in public. And I guess I want to know, with response to anti-Semitism, is it possible for Jews and scholars of Jews and people talking about Jews to recognize fundamental differences, as well as the things that Relly talks about, a baseline agreement about Israel? I'm kind of asking the same question again in different words, but this time I want to push each of you to either say, no, there have to be baseline agreements, or there has to be an argument for some kind of public disagreement. And you can also tell me that I just created a binary and that in itself is not a reasonable question.
Yeah.
Just very briefly.
So my view on that, I think, of course, we need to allow for disagreement, and it's part of actually should be part of any culture. It's part of also democracy. We should invite people to the conversation, to the table. And by the way, I personally have seen, more kind of heard from other Hillel students or people on campus including SJP and JVP to talk, and have been refused to actually talk to them because they're Zionists, right? I think our obligation is to actually always invite people to the table. But again, it goes back to maybe as I started, what I take from ethics and what I learned from ethics and what I research in ethics, right? Sure, there is, and when I finish my business ethics class, I'm like teaching also executive MBAs and people or leaders and managers, I say, we talked about all of complexities, there are different frameworks, there is consequentialism and the ontology and moral foundation theory and so forth, and there are kind of different moral dilemmas. So there is complexity, but you should not let this complexity absolve you from the responsibility to also know that there is also right or wrong. There's also basic values of respect, dignity for all, right? And don't dance this dance and be clear about it, and don't use complexity as an excuse to kind of say that there is no those basics. So the same I would say here again for me. We have to put and it's okay, and it's actually good to show disagreement about Israel's action, the government, whether right, left, all it's good, and we should show this. For me, and I know maybe it's me, but for me, it's hard to accept that we should allow people to say that only the Jewish people does not have a right to exist, right? As a Jewish state, given that you don't see it in you don't say it about any other people in the world. And it's already a fact that there is people, it exists. So for me, if people are saying you do not have a right, we should dismantle the state of Israel, is a backward looking rather than forward looking, view. I would say, think about it. If you want to accept the assumption that we should also have this right, like everyone, join the table. If not, have express your views respectfully. But definitely for me, it's a kind of a necessary condition for conversation to acknowledge, dignity for all.
Nicely and clearly stated. Ken?
Sure. I agree that empathy and intellectual curiosity are really, good things. And I agree with you that the anti-normalization, refusal to talk, exclusion of Zionist students in some spaces I don't know that I necessarily always say that it's anti-Semitic. Sometimes it is. I mean, when they're saying we're looking for groups that have Zionist sounding names, they're not talking about Pastor Hagee. But the reality is that it's a McCarthyism, and I also see it on the other side. Some of the Hillel guidelines are not going to allow discussion in Hillel, of breaking the silence, and IDF groups that are opposed to and others that are opposed to Zionism. There's a decision to be made there about, do you want to have again a big tent or not. I worry about the sort of the what I saw in Germany recently, and I think this is the one thing that I wish the Jewish community could agree on here and there, is that anti-Semitism should be a term that isn't watered down, that it should sting, that we should really save it for the clearest cases, and not default to labeling things so quickly, which is where I think we're going. And what happened in Germany is that the IRA definition was adopted into law, and there were Jews who were protesting the Gaza war, and the definition was used to label them as anti-Semites. And I was taken by a statement by somebody who was commenting on this phenomenon, who said, isn't it ironic the German state is yet again classifying what it means to be a Jew, what's a legitimate Jewish position. So I'm worried that the conversation about anti-Semitism is going to lead us into some really dark places if we don't basically say that anti-Semitism should not be the explanation for all things we may disagree with, and that we should use the word conservatively as opposed to ubiquitously.
Thank you. Thank you. David?
Well, first of all, I agree with that 100%. That won't come as a surprise based on what I've already said. The idea that that the Jewish community as a community is going to agree on anything, I think is a fantasy.
But I'm not sure everyone knows that.
Well, anyone who watches this, I guess, if they agree with me, will know it. I mean, I don't, we should agree. Why we should be agreeing on something now when we have not been able to do that historically. I mentioned the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, of which I'm a former chair. So one of the only places, one of the few spaces in the Jewish community where Reformed, conservative, and Orthodox organizations will sit and cooperate with one another. And there you're dealing with a fairly centrist sort of group of organizations, and even there are going to be there are significant disagreements. So I think that I just don't think that that's realistic. I'm sorry to keep circling back to this, but I do also want to come back to your question about how bad, because there's another thing that I wanted to mention, another idea that I came across recently that I was really taken by, and this is the concept of ambient anti-Semitism. Nice. That Jonathan Boyd out of London has written about. And this has to do with how people are, how Jews specifically are feeling. And it's not this particular incident or that particular incident, but it's just a sense that there's more going on in the air. When I take my dog for a walk in the morning, I go by a wall that's used by graffiti artists. And my question is there going to be something up there that says Zog today? Or Jew Lives Matter? I've got pictures, I've got the receipts. So it's in the air when Jews are legitimately or not afraid to be perceived publicly as Jews, whether it's wearing a kippah or a chai or a youth group T-shirt or putting a mezuzah up or whatever. That again, you might not be able to hang that fear on a particular hook, but it has to do with, I think, a broader sort of environmental phenomenon that comes from all portions. And again, maybe revealing more about myself, I'm very concerned right now about the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, specifically in the campus setting, in ways that I think are dangerous for the Jewish community. Again, being instrumentalized for other agendas and other interests, which again is a pattern. And I would also say that, again, some of the political discourse around Israel is also being weaponized in that way. Stop me if I'm going on too long, but when I hear people talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition and are using that as a stick to beat up Muslims, I get concerned because when that agenda is done,
Who's next?
then where's the attention going to go?
Exactly, exactly. And I want to turn to that in just a moment. You've anticipated me, but I had a couple of loose threads that I wanted to tie up before we do that. One of them has to do with Ken's observation about campuses and the Jewish communal location on campuses. As the director of the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies here at Maryland, I am very grateful to the Association for Jewish Studies, which brings together a lot of the department chairs. And we sit, and it's like, it's like the old Jewish joke. One person says, oi, and one person says, ugh, and then somebody else says, I thought we weren't going to talk politics. But the reality is that every campus is different. Every campus is different because of the size of the campus, whether it's urban or rural, how many other campuses are around it, how public it is, and by public, I mean how permeable, and also what state it's in and whether it's public or private. And one of the things I wanted to point out is you all have referenced a bunch of organizations that people might not know about. Hillel or Hillel International is a very old, very established Jewish community space for Jewish students on campus. They have religious services, but they also do tons and tons of cultural practices and programs. Chabad Lubavitch is another setting where students can find, especially an Orthodox Jewish community, but a highly welcoming Orthodox Jewish community that's happy to have anybody who's Jewish. And in a funny sort of way, you can go to a campus where the academic Jewish studies program is run by the same person who's running Hillel, or you can go to a place where they're not talking to each other. So every campus is negotiating not only anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in a space where Jewish students have different opportunities, Jewish staffs feel different levels of comfort or discomfort, and Jewish faculty feel different levels of responsibility. Some people just come in and they teach their class on the Holocaust and they go home. For other people, they're also involved with all kinds of student programming and stuff. So some of the diversity that we're talking about is differences of opinion, but some of that diversity is difference of life experience and who is going to be in a coalition with whom. And that's just within Jewish communities in the US. So talking about anti-Semitism is going to have different experiences for people who are academics in very small communities or people who are religious leaders in very large ones. There's a lot of different stuff going on. I'd like to actually turn now to your observation, David, about the mobilization of anti-Semitism, and to Ken's observation about the idea that anti-Semitism as an accusation should sting. You've done a wonderful job of defining terms, telling us what anti-Semitism is, telling us how it relates to anti-Zionism. I'd now like you to solve the problem. You have plenty of time, maybe half an hour. And the first question that I want to bring in terms of solving that problem is this problem of language and who says what and what they get to say. David, you've suggested that it's very, very dangerous for Jewish people to be favored as minorities because the next step is an inevitable pivot. Can you all talk to me a little bit about this idea of anti-Semitism as a tool for silencing unpopular speech and more to the point, to talk, if you will, tachlis, to get to the conclusion, what should we as academics be doing to make sure that a term that we're sort of throwing around doesn't become its own worst enemy? Here, I'm not talking so much about anti-Semitism as about, if you will, anti-Semitism. So are there things that we as scholars or y'all as public intellectuals, people operating in different academic settings, are there things that we can do along the lines of, but not limited to, Ken's wonderful observation about reserving the term for used to refer to something that should make people horrified that they're being accused of it, not to have people have it roll off their backs. And then what do we do for other terminology or other language? How do we talk about hatred of Jews or hatred of Israel? And how do we negotiate who gets to use those terms? So if you can solve that problem for us, that would be excellent. David, would you like to start, or shall we ask one of your cohort?
Well, just to get the ball rolling. um, I think that the ability of academics and religious leaders and so forth to influence this discourse is limited.
Okay.
And it's limited because the audience or the audiences that we get to address are themselves limited. It's limited because the discussion is by definition nuanced, and nuance is also not particularly popular these days. And again, going back to what I was talking about, the limited audience, who has the bigger audience, right? The bigger audience is going to be politicians. It's going to be social media people, and that is not those are not generally sources of nuanced, well thought out positions or definitions.
Let me push you on that a little bit, because you're exactly right. And given that we know that, what's the trick? I mean, is there a way to be nuanced and fast? Is there a way to be nuanced and public?
Well,
I mean, the others in a second, but I want to poke you on that.
Yes, but what I'm gonna say is that it's kind of like water dripping on a stone.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually the stone will wear away.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a long and slow process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to some extent, if we want to take a look at take a really long view, and Ken was touching on this earlier, and I think in a different position, but from a different perspective, but over the last, let's say, century and a half, right? What has happened in terms of the way anti-Semitism is understood and addressed, and what people's sort of emotional or moral reaction to it is. I think there have been, I think we can point to, changes and positive changes in that realm. Has it led to complete societal change? No, or at least not yet. And again, some of this simply has to do with numbers and embeddedness and so forth. But again, I think I'm going to go back to this embeddedness in Western culture and the difficulty of rooting out something that is so interwoven, so part of the DNA, if I may say that, I like to quote that great academic Tom Lear from his song National Brotherhood Week.
National Brotherhood
right?
Week.
Which has the line, and everybody hates the Jews, right? I don't know that everybody hates but he put his finger on something something there. And again, I'm not a fatalist, but again, we're talking about a deep societal phenomenon. So
yeah. Okay, thank you very, very much for taking the plunge. Ken, you looked like you were about to.
Yeah, I was going to say that, my favorite Tom Lehrer line from a different song is sliding down the razor blade of life. But be that as it may, a couple of thoughts. One is that I think we have to acknowledge that we're in a more difficult time to solve these issues just because of what happened on October 7th and its aftermath, right? I mean, the tensions were there before. I wrote a book about it 5 years ago. David and I've been dealing with this for a long time. But after October 7th, the history of what happens to Jews around the world when there's war involving Israel is it's not good. There's always been an uptick in attacks, anti-Semitism, so forth. This time it hasn't stopped. And the brutality of the Hamas attack for people in the Jewish community. I mean, I'm not a great trauma believer, but it absolutely raised family stories of the Holocaust and the pogroms. I was thinking of my great-grandfather who I never met, who was strung up by the Cossacks. You know, those stories come back. And for the Palestinian folks, how can you not think of the Nakba with going on, moving here and there? So that tension, I think, makes it harder to solve the problem at the moment until we get to whatever the other side of this is. And I really do hope it's a two-state solution, but we're not there yet. To David's point about politics, I agree, and we haven't really grasped with how to deal with the fact that hate works in politics. Because if it didn't work in politics, politicians wouldn't use it. And we haven't figured out yet how to do it, make it cost rather than make it work. And that happens in the media too. So I think, you know, there's no silver bullet, but we can look inside certain institutions to do better. And I think the academy is certainly one of them. We were talking before about different programs and ways to teach. I think one of the things that academics can do is to model disagreement. I mean, places like Dartmouth after October 7th, Susanna Heschel and others. This is how we do it. We disagree. Ask any questions you want. We're an intellectual community. We invite disagreement. That's a positive thing. One of the things I do when I go on campuses and do a public presentation is I usually end with something like this to the students, you know, saying that, look, you can feel passionate. I think it's great. 20 years ago, people, you know, were saying students were not passionate. Now you're passionate. I may disagree with how you're expressing it, but caring about the world is an important thing. That you know, none of you are going to solve Israel-Palestine, but you do have control over how you treat your classmates. And you should also have intellectual curiosity and emotional empathy to figure out why somebody who's this otherwise friendly student in your physics class or dance class or your literature class, whatever, has these views that you think are not only wrong but evil. It's an environment where you can imagine that. You can think of how you would look at the world if you were in their shoes. And I usually tell them when I was a criminal defense lawyer, it would have been malpractice for me not to think about how the prosecutor would have handled the case. And if only to make me a better advocate. So if you want to be an advocate on one side or the other, you should engage discussions rather than say it's too evil to engage them. And I think those are the types of things that can have a little bit of an effect.
I like that. I like that. I like this idea of modeling disagreement, and I like the idea of giving students the capacity themselves to take ownership of their own understanding and to listen to other people. Really, you haven't had a chance to comment on this yet. Would you like to
Sure.
comment?
So first, building off what Ken was saying, and I also remember following up Dartmouth and actually watching, I think they had something a few days or not long after October 7th, and really this is the way to go. And I forgot his name, an Egyptian, actually, I think an Egyptian scholar, who actually said, sure, you can go and say those things in your protest, rape is resistance, but do you really, you can legally, do you really want to say this to your people who have relatives that have been hostages or people who have been raped there and so forth? Probably not, right? At least saying this and kind of not being just silent about it. I do think we have, I actually do think we have, and again, I don't want to go to politics. We have no control there, and we of course have no control over what's happening in Israel. But I do think we do have a lot of control about what's happening in the academia, and I think we've done a good job of actually talking about those issues. I don't think we've done a good job of having, for example, through curriculum, encourage students to do this, to do a mandatory orientation to all the students that talk about all forms of hate, to challenge their assumptions that sometimes actually come from, you know, TikTok or whatever it is, to learn the history of conflicts before they make any judgment or opinion. I don't think we've done enough to actually represent in departments that talk about this, like political science, Jewish studies, and so forth, to actually have people who provide a breadth of ideas and reading and encourage more to constantly kind of check whether, again, I said it before, and but this is, so I'm feeling like a broken record, but to keep asking, are you violating basic assumption of dignity and respect for all? And kind of present students with those questions. Sure, it's legal, but would you protest and call for killing of Black people, right? Would you have, like this person in Colombia that had a sign that says El Qassam Brigade, which is Hamas military wing and pointing to the Jewish community, right? Would you do this? Would you protest for annihilating any country that already exists, for targeting civilians, torturing, raping, and so forth? Even actually asking and telling, yeah, sure, you want to protest against the Israeli government, sure, make sure that it doesn't come with harassment of Jewish students, with any connection to terror organization, right? So we should protect free speech. We should all be about due process when there are problems. I don't think it means closing our eyes to dangerous dynamics that are happening. Also on campus, like exclusion of Jews, Israelis funding. We know already there is an investigation of funding that is connected to terror organizations, to Hamas. We should actually be very aware of this and kind of advocate for investigating this. And again, to me, I go back to the point of ethics rather than legality. So for me, it's always imagine university leaders saying, again, you have the right to do it, but do you really want to call for an annihilation of a state? Is it helpful to call for a boycott only in Israel when you know there is a side that perpetrated the conflict, when 40% of students in University of Haifa are actually Muslim, the rector is Muslim? Does it help to punish, the research that is doing so good for the world? So kind of asking those questions and having statements that are actually raising those questions so students can actually think about it. I also think that we've had this very dangerous thing that happened in some of the department in which we are, and we talked about labels, right? So we take those, we don't speak out against using wrong labels when we should not, when they're actually not reflecting reality, right? Because this can lead to more of this tropes and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
I'm gonna cut you off just to ask you to sharpen your point, because this goes back to my question of getting at some real pragmatics. So is there language that you can think about that's really helpful, or are there ways of opening things up? I want to reiterate your comment, and then I'll let you respond, that learning the history of conflicts before making judgments or opinions feels like basic scholarship, that the basic assumption and dignity of dignity and respect for all feels like basic humanity. At the same time, that leads me to ask, is there a way to disagree with people that does those things, that brings the empathy and the history, and that also allows for critique? You're making a really interesting argument here, and I'm wondering, are there things that as an academic you want to see people do when they disagree with you?
Yeah. Yes, and I think that's a great question. Again, I want academics to push students to use accurate terms, right? To call Israel a white colonizer, maybe this circles back to my introduction of myself, is a wrong term. First, Israel is not white, right? But again, it doesn't matter this, and definitely it's not definition of a colonizer as a small state in the Middle East. If you look back in the Middle East, this is not colonized. Now, you want to talk about the settlements and say that this violates actually any preparation for a Palestinian state, sure, talk about this with accurate terms, right? Don't talk about apartheid within the state of Israel, again, this does not fit the definition of apartheid.
Okay, so I have to cut you off again. I'm really going to push because I know we like each other and I can do that. What if someone said to you, it does fit for the following reasons? Would you feel comfortable, this is leading into a bigger question I'm going to ask, saying it does not fit and then engaging with someone on their claims? Or do you think that the use of some terms like apartheid, like settler colonialism, are so closing of dialogue that it's impossible to talk with people who make those terms? So again, let me reiterate my question. It's clear to me that you have strong standards of academic values and humanism. If someone comes to you and says, I disagree, I think it's apartheid for the following reasons, is that a conversation that's worth having?
Sure, it's worth having, but again, in the end of the day, I think we have to have the conversation in order to understand, and this is the role of faculty to actually bring, because again, and I'm sorry, I will push back here again. We want, this is part of the education to show that this does not resemble an apartheid. That taking for, and maybe another point, that taking and projecting from the US, from black and white, conflict, and project it to the US because it's easy to simplify the world this way. When in Israel, it is actually not about ethnicity or race. And when there are checkpoints in Israel, it's also related to terror attacks. So it's which is very different from the US. So this simplifying the world and kind of encouraging academic doctrines that are actually just perpetuating this in a way that is, again, factually untrue. This is why we call it the fact-based dialogue. It is just not the case. We have to be much more intentional and thinking and educated in the academia. So yes, we should have the discussion, but we should also bring all the facts there to the discussion so people understand that those inaccurate terms are actually hurting.
Okay, and I do want to reiterate again that inaccurate can also mean disagreement. You might see something as inaccurate that someone else believes they've done a lot of hard research on, and then that creates, in my little fantasy, that creates an opportunity.
Sure.
May I go ahead to a next question, and then we can always circle back and fill in?
Yeah, I just one more,
Please, go right ahead.
one more thing, because I think it's important and connects back to Ken was talking about this before. And so Ken, you mentioned the Sway AI, which I also looked at it and followed. And I remember looking at it and in the beginning, like being very excited about this. And then I remember trying it out and also seeing that in the first kind of screening, there was like different questions, kind of more philosophical question, does God exist? I don't remember. And then there was this item, Israel is committing genocide. And I remember that I thought to myself, how come this is the item instead of having an item that says, for example, Israel's response after October 7th is inappropriate? Why are you putting this term before the conversation even started instead of letting it organically happen throughout the conversation? And actually, this is the whole point of this, right? To talk about this, to see whether you should use the word genocide or whether there are other things that are happening there. But by putting it there, you're creating inadvertently just, you bring this one side that is actually, again, based on what I see as the definition of genocide, intentionally targeting civilians, is wrong. So I think we have to put more, and I actually emailed them kind of saying, why not, even from a research scientific point, when we do a survey, we try to have a neutral language and then see what happened. But when you phrase it this way, you already created something that I don't think your platform actually was intending to. And for me, it was a shame because I saw it as a great way to start discussion and get away from using inaccurate labels and extremist labels and actually have a conversation that kind of lets people have a respectful dialogue. So
Excellent, really. This is getting down in the weeds in a way that I think is productive. Ken, can you speak to that?
Sure. I don't know what Simon and Nick told you, but my guess is what they wanted to do was to find people who actually had that view. And as we know, there are a lot of people on campus that are saying that Israel is committing genocide. And when I talk about it, I have, the same sort of qualms of, I'm not an international law scholar, but the intentionality aspect of it is one that makes me question. I mean, it's awful regardless of whether it is or it isn't, but they're trying to put people in, here's how you view abortion, pro-life, pro-choice, and put them in the buckets and then have the so that was more of a sorting exercise, and it reflects the fact that people actually do have that view. I was at a conference of NYU on anti-Semitism a while ago, and somebody asked me in a session, about if somebody accused you of condoning, genocide, what would you do? And he wanted me to say, it was not a U.S. person, wanted me to say, oh, that speech should not be allowed. And I said, I'm so happy that you asked that question, because that allows me to have a conversation about it. One of the things that, when I talk on campus is a couplet from my book that I think illustrates this, about the settler colonial issue. I repeat Packby talking to actually an American Indian group that was coming to something in Tel Aviv. Don't come, it's a betrayal. You're victims of settler colonialism, just like us. And then I contrast that with Judea Pearl, who's the father of Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was beheaded, who's a scholar at UCLA, and he said, name me another settler colonial place where people are speaking the language before the current, indigenous inhabitants. Name me another settler colonial place where people have been talking about it in poetry and prose for thousands of years. Name me another settler colonial place where people don't name cities New York, New Baghdad, New Berlin, but names in biblical times. And then I quote a scholar that says, real history is the ability to absorb both of those things at the same time and navigate them. If you go down one rabbit hole or another, it's really just communal advocacy. And I think that's an important point, that people have these views. I may disagree with them, nearly as much as you do, but the point is not to say, here's the language we're going to allow you to use before we have the conversation. It's to recognize that there are people using that language, and we want to engage them. And one final thing on a larger aspect of this is my wife, who David knows, is a colleague of his. It goes apoplectic whenever she sees that on the TV, the last channel that was on was Fox News or Newsmax. How can you watch that stuff? And I'm saying, there are millions of people that believe the world that way, and I want to look at it through their eyes. So I'm not going to tell them that they're absolutely wrong. I want to understand it so I can figure out how to engage it.
Well, that is the perfect place to take us to one last question. And then I'm going to give you the opportunity to each have one parting comment, which I hope will be about the future and not just the present. And that one last question is also about the future. One of the questions I've been asking my colleagues, and the question I want to ask you, is whether there is a potential for coalition across communities of people who share standards of ethics, morality, free speech, democracy, and perhaps quite differently in their content, but similarly in their values, social justice. What are we supposed to do now? There are on every campus in this country, no matter how calm it's been, a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of people who feel betrayed, a lot of people who feel that they have spent their whole lives working for a better America and a better academia, and suddenly feel that their partnerships are shattered. Is there a possibility for coalitions that include people who support Israel, people who don't support Israel, people who are Jewish, people who are not Jewish, in the academic world where a lot of the discourse has gone in one direction? Is it possible to bring about coalition, or is the conflict just too bitter? I'd be grateful if you could each address this for a moment, and then, as I said, you're each welcome to sort of parting comments.
Okay.
Dave?
First of all, I'm not really on a campus, so I can't really speak to that out of personal experience. When I think about this question, I think about something, for example, ALMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Which is a coalition of, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere between 100 and 200 organizations that are working for coexistence and so forth. Across religious lines, across ethnic lines, and so forth. And again, this maybe goes back to my drop of water on a stone sort of thing. If there's hope for some kind of peaceful settlement, I think it's more likely to come from these people building a kind of society from the ground up than it is going to come, and this probably says a lot about me, but it's going to come from the political leadership. I think that this may be going back a little bit, but I also think that it is possible to have serious and deep conversations about these issues. It requires everyone to be willing to be vulnerable, and to listen deeply to what somebody else is saying. And I think that can happen in a lot of different settings. It can't happen at a protest, because you have 8 words on a sign, and that's about as deep as it can go, and obviously emotions and so forth. But I think it's not only possible, but I think it's necessary, and I'm going to tie that back because I think it's people having those kinds of conversations that helps lead to the establishment of the kind of organizations that one finds in ALMAP, and whether it's the parents circle or the former combatants group, or again, I'm not going to list 100 and whatever, but and some of that, of course, comes not out of an academic or an intellectual pursuit, but out of life experience and personal pain and so forth, which is also, I think, an important factor. So again, I don't know if I avoided your question sufficiently, but
it was excellent avoidance of my question. Thank you very much. Ken?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things, that could be done, particularly on a campus. One of the reasons why I advocate hate studies, beyond the fact that hatred works out on all these different dynamics simultaneously, and this is an effort like in medicine or architecture or other fields to pull together to address a human need and a thing that human history tells us we should understand better. So whenever there are places that are emphasizing, BARD has, I forgot how many courses we have in our hate studies initiative, but it underscores the question that we're looking at: how do we get into these buckets of defining who's an us, who's a them, what are the implications, where does it get to demonization, dehumanization? When you have that as part of the gestalt of a campus, it makes it a little bit easier to have those conversations. Second thing, on the questions of people going down their rabbit holes on Israel and Palestine, if you have enough of a critical mass to pull together people, say we fundamentally disagree, but we really want to learn a little bit more about why we have these disagreements, and are willing to do tech study, with food and wine over a few days, it can be difficult, but I think it's productive and helps set something on the campus. There's a third element too for the larger aspect. It doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but it tells me how to think about it a little bit. There's a book that the center is having come out that I'm editing in the fall, the University of Toronto. It's called Simply Human, A Guide to Understanding and Combating Hate. And one chapter I solicited in it is from a South African academic named Adam Levin. And he writes from literary theory about multi-directional memory. And what's really interesting in that is he underscores that memory isn't static. It's defined by the current political needs. Memory of one group interacts with another group. I mean, he was looking at in South Africa, how blacks and Jews came together on hate crimes. There were a whole bunch of other, and it fell apart after October 7th too. So memory doesn't stay all the time, but to look at those dynamics of how do we remember the past, and being aware of how do we try to build things that are more across the tissue. And one example that I suggested him that he used, and David may remember this, years ago, there was a big debate when there was going to be an exhibition about Japanese concentration camps in the and the Jewish community by and large was going crazy. It's our term. You're belittling the Holocaust. How can you do this? And the Japanese American folks were saying, this is our experience. How dare you, tell us what the terms are. And we sat around the table because people had worked together and made memories about things like, reparations for internment camps and so forth. And what we came up with was a big sign at the beginning of the exhibition that basically said, here's what concentration camp means. It goes back to the Boer War, that there was a fundamental difference between Nazi extermination camps where they were, doing experiments, gassing people, burning people, pulling out gold fillings and so forth. And these camps, but what they had in common was that some group in society was separated from the mainstream of society and everybody else let it happen. So those are ways of trying to negotiate memories, finding the commonalities and the things to emphasize while also recognizing the differences.
Thank you very much, Ken. Relly?
Thank you. Yeah, so I would 100% agree on, yes, we have to make ourselves vulnerable and encourage everyone and the students and encourage and role model those conversations. I do think, though, we can only do that if we also are very conscious about having and kind of growing and hiring faculty that are going to do it the right way and are going to also bring this and not be one side or another, to actually bring those conversations, so you can actually correct for maybe some of those anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist kind of terms. I remember when we did recently this negotiation in the Middle East panel. Someone emailed our university president saying, in 25 years, this is the first kind of event when someone actually made the case for Israel has a right to exist just like any other country. And I thought this was sad that people are kind of afraid to engage with this all the time, because we always have to almost, be afraid to say something that, again, should be basic. I also remember, by the way, shortly after October 7, I'm working as academic director of a master's program, and one of a person working in admission, a Black woman, actually took me for lunch. She was absolutely amazing, and she kind of wanted to take me to lunch just to say, I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. And I kind of feel that, we as Black people also experience a lot of those. And I was very grateful. And I remember also it also made me realize that now I'm very conscious about telling people every day, unlike Black people who cannot make the choice of whether the identity is salient because it's in their skin, I have a choice that I can make every day, whether I want to make my identity salient, whether I want to wear my Star of David. And I feel it's my responsibility to do that, to signal, yes, I'm a person. First, I'm not a government, and I have the right to kind of be proud of my culture, and again, this is part, I feel a lot of Israeli people on campus feel very betrayed, because it's almost, no, we are not, this is not part of um the and again, there's no problem with me to be anti-Israel government. This anti-Israel as a country, for me, I cannot be proud of, I have to be afraid to be proud of my country, is to me is actually horrific. And I don't think we allow for those conversations ever to happen, especially since October 7th, and apart from part of the campuses. So I think we need to be very bold in doing that, and having those conversations, and again, always tying it back to basic humanity, and there has to be a recognition of the other side, right? This is also, by the way, going to negotiation. If the other party is not willing to recognize you as your right to exist, also as a collective Jew, then we cannot actually talk, right? So we have to encourage this mutual recognition in order to allow for those conversations. So
Thank you, Relly.
so again, all goes to those, we have responsibility as educators to think about being ethical leaders as well. I do feel that, unfortunately, for the last year and a half, many university leaders didn't want to handle this, and it led to really horrific things that happened on campuses, as opposed to kind of just being very clear about it, very, very intentional about promoting dialogue rather than violent rallies and so forth. And maybe
And I think that's probably a great place to take a pause, because that's exactly where I was going to go. I'd like to ask each of you if you'd like to just say a very few words about the future. If you'd like one little parting shot. I realize it's completely unfair of me, because then I'm going to take the final parting shot. But Ken, do you have just a few words?
Sure. I mean, I underscore the importance of empathy, and part of the pushback on all this is not to go down these binary rabbit holes. And part of what the anti-Israel stuff and the anti-Israel's right to exist is, again, thinking of the binary, all good, one bad, and not to have the complexity. So pushing back on that, pushing the idea that we're all human beings first, and the more noble we are, that will be when we see the humanity on both sides and can empathize with both sides and imagine ourselves on both sides, both as a Palestinian and as a Jewish Israeli. The more that we get those messages, that's an important thing. And in terms of teaching, one of the things I do, and I wish more professors would do it. When I teach a course on anti-Semitism, we get to Israel, we get to Zionism. I know students can Google me, they know what I think. And what I tell them is there's one sure way to get a bad grade in my class, and that's to parrot back to me what you think I think. I want to hear what you think, and you'll do better in my class if you disagree with me. You have to provide evidence for why you disagree with me, but I encourage you strongly to do that. And the more that people will do that, I think you'll have a better environment for having constructive discussions.
Lovely, lovely. Really brief parting shot.
Well, actually, just building up. First, I love that you do that, Ken. And I know I remember I read the book The Age of Grievance by Frank Bruni recently, and he teaches journalism at Duke, and he also talks about how this is how he actually says you'll get more if you actually disagree with me. I know when I did the session as part of the Challenge Your Thinking, Challenge the Conversation class on the Middle East, I actually opened because I also knew that if as much as I can say this, some people will not say what they think maybe. So I actually opened an anonymous survey after the class, and I told them to put, whatever they thought or any comments. And in the following class, I actually addressed those comments that were given out, and we did a bit of back and forth like this. And again, I wish it were not anonymous, but at least and there were pushbacks, some of them, which some of them I didn't like, but I actually did provide the facts to why I think differently. So I think this is really important. I had another thing that I was thinking about as Ken was talking, which I'm blanking on for a second. I'll let David speak, and then if I remember this, because I forgot what I wanted to say.
David?
Yeah.
Well, the future. First of all, I think a lot of what Ken said is spot on. So I would agree with that. I think that hard conversations require some agreement on the meaning of terminology, or at least an acknowledgement that there's a disagreement on the meaning of terminology. But simply using the terminology without defining it, I think, is part of the problem. I think that I'm very concerned about this political moment, because I think not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world, we see a drift towards authoritarianism, if that's a fair word to use. And that is never a good sign for Jews or for others who are othered, if I may use that terminology. So I'm very concerned about that. The fact that I regularly find myself going back to, where am I going to go if I need to leave? Which is not something that I was thinking about 5 years ago, right? That's in my head now. And a completely unrelated thing, I think that one of the terms that is least understood, or terms that are least understood in this debate, are Jews and Judaism. I mean, I would say, just to be provocative, there is no such thing as Judaism. I would also say Jews are not a religion, and I realize at the end of something, to throw those things on the table is a little bit problematic, but I think and I think that one could also challenge people to say, well, who is a Palestinian, for example, and we can put other definitions in there as well. So I would push for understanding our terminology as something that's really foundational.
Thank you. Thank you.
Remember
David,
what I wanted to say.
okay, very briefly, please.
Yeah, very briefly. So because you talked before about also coalitions, right? So I also think this was the point. I also think one of the things that I consciously try to do now when we handle this subject is to actually bring those real coalitions between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Muslims and Arabs, right? So in the panel that we brought Palestinian who lived in a refugee camp, who was actually started his career documenting in B'Tselem, but documenting human rights violation by IDF, but also then transitioned to actually document Hamas violations of human rights. And he's actually, again, advocating for stop this two-state solution, or this Ahmed Fuad al-Khatib. I started with him, and he has this realigning for Palestine. I want to invite him to class to talk about what is the realigning for Palestine, and talking about, abandoning terror and coming to like a coexistence, right? So I think bringing those voices and bringing those coalitions and model them in the classroom so students can actually see that there is a conversation, again, elevating the moderates rather than the extremes, is something that is really important that we can and we have control over in the academia.
Thank you so much, Relly. We've heard a lot and we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about empathy and fundamental humanity. We've talked about digging into complexities, not letting things be easier than they are. We've talked about the need for evidence and the need for disagreement and for arguing and for thinking about terms and recognizing that conversation partners might mean different things in the terms they use, might not agree on points along the way or even final outcomes, but that fundamentally the ability to listen and the ability to try to understand, even when it's difficult, even when it falls apart, are some of the things that we can be doing in the classroom, in more general dialogues on campus, and hopefully also across the United States, and not only in a campus setting. I do really want to thank the University of Maryland for supporting this dialogue. As someone who's working in Jewish studies, but who also works in comparative religion, I cannot say enough how important it is to talk about the details, to understand and recognize disagreement, and to have the opportunity to hear what other people have to say and to think deeply about it, whether that changes your own view or not. I am very proud to be a Terp and very proud to be here with all of you having this conversation. And I truly can't thank you enough. Relly, Ken, David, you've brought your full selves, you brought your academic selves, you've answered hard questions, and I don't think we've even all agreed with each other all the time, but we've really put out there the importance of having this conversation and of really fighting for clarity, specificity, nuance, respect, and shared humanity. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
We share deep gratitude for Ken Stern, Dr. Relly Dürfler-Lozen, and Rabbi David Sandmel for this incredible conversation and for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. Special thanks to Dr. Grossman for her always amazing facilitation skills. We encourage you to read Ken Stern's book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, available at all major bookstores. We also encourage you to reflect upon what you have learned from this discussion, to open up even further dialogue with friends, colleagues, and classmates to navigate these difficult topics with compassion and care.
To stay up to date on events and initiatives from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, you can visit our website at diversity.umd.edu. Sign up for our newsletter at go.umd.edu/ODI subscribe, and follow us on Instagram at Diverse Terps. We hope that you continue to engage with this critical learning around the experiences of Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, Palestinian, and Arab peoples. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next installment in the series.